The warning lights on the console weren't just flashing. They were bleeding red across Jackson's vision, sinking with the frantic hammer of his heart against his ribs. The hull groaned, a deep, metallic scream of alloy being twisted by forces it was never designed to withstand. Outside the viewport, the stars were wrong-stretched into nauseating streaks of violet and bruise-black. He could taste copper in his mouth, the sharp tang of adrenaline, and biting through his tongue when the inertial dampeners failed. "Hold it together," he gritted out, his knuckles white as he fought the yoke. The void skipper bucked like a wounded animal. "Don't you die on me now, you beautiful broken pile of junk." Behind him, the hum of the experimental drive was rising to a pitch that vibrated in his teeth. It wasn't the clean, steady purr of a standard engine. It was a chaotic, tearing sound, like fabric ripping in a gale. The alien fleet was locking on. He could see the targeting vectors painting the hull on the display, a dozen predatory eyes fixing on their throat. He didn't know the math. He didn't know if the probability jump would splatter them across 3 dimensions or just vaporize them instantly. He only knew that the alternative was being turned into space dust by the heavy cruisers bearing down on their stern. He slammed the throttle forward, watching the energy output spike into the critical red zone. The world dissolved into white noise and violent motion. But truthfully, before the screaming started, before the universe tried to tear itself in half to kill him, there was only the silence of an empty stomach and the crushing weight of being broke on Station 7 Alpha. 72 hours earlier, Jackson had been standing in the acidic rain of the lower trade district, checking his credit sheet for the 5th time in a minute. The number hadn't changed. It stared back at him, pathetic and mocking. 2,000 credits. That was the sum total of 5 years spent crawling through wreckage, breathing recycled air that tasted like old socks, and nearly losing his left hand to a maglock failure in the scrapyard nebula. 2,000 credits was enough to buy a ticket to a worse station, or enough to drink himself into a coma for a month. It wasn't enough to live. Not really. He shoved the chip into his pocket and pulled his collar up against the drizzle. The rain on 7 Alpha was industrial runoff, condensed from the massive atmospheric processes and spat back down on the slums. It smelled of sulfur and bad decisions. Jackson moved through the crowd, keeping his head down. He was invisible here, just another soft-skinned biped in a sea of chitin and scales. A massive Valkyrie merchant lumbered past, its 8 legs clicking rhythmically on the metal deck, brushing Jackson aside without even a glance. To them, he was clutter. Vermin. Humans were the bottom feeders of the galactic food chain, good for fitting into tight crawl spaces and working for wages that wouldn't buy a decent meal on a core world. He turned down a narrow alleyway, dodging a puddle of glowing blue fluid that hissed against the grating. The sign above the door was flickering, half the letters burnt out. Liquidation and recovery. The auction house smelled like antiseptic and dust. It was a cold, sterile room, a sharp contrast to the humid, chaotic filth outside. Jackson wiped his boots on the mat, trying to look like he belonged, trying to project an air of solvency he didn't possess. The room was mostly empty. A few bored-looking Thros officers sat in the back, their blue skins stark against the grey uniforms, speaking in low, rumbling tones. A Valkyrie broker was cleaning its optical sensors with a microfiber cloth, ignoring the display screens. Jackson took a seat in the 3rd row. The silence here was heavy, oppressive. It felt like a waiting room for the dead. Lot 847, the auctioneer droned. It was a synthetic voice, devoid of inflection, coming from a floating drone at the front of the room. Vin Imperial Courier. Designation, Void Skipper. Class, military grade. Status, unclaimed. The hologram flickered to life in the center of the room. Jackson's breath hitched. The ship was sleek, predatory, a dagger made of dark metal. It didn't look like the boxy, utilitarian haulers humans usually flew. It looked fast. It looked dangerous. It had curves that defied the blocky aesthetic of modern ship design, aggressive lines that spoke of a time when the Vin Empire burned half the galaxy. But it was the silence from the other bidders that was the loudest thing in the room. The Thros officers stopped talking. The Valkyrie broker actually took a step back. Opening bid 2,000 credits, the drone announced. That was impossibly low. A hull like that, even stripped for parts, was worth 50 times that amount. The scrap metal alone could set Jackson up for life. He looked around. waiting for the paddles to go up, waiting for the corporate buyers to sniff out the profit and bury him. Nothing. The throws officer made a gesture. Jackson recognized a ward against evil. He heard the word cursed ripple through the translator in his ear. Ship history indicate 3 prior owners, the drone continued, oblivious to the mood. Current status of owners unknown. Vessel recovered drifting in deep space. Twice. Superstition. That was the only reason this thing wasn't already sold. The galaxy was old, and species like the Thros and Valkyrie had long memories. They remembered the Vin, and they remembered the stories of ships that ate their crews. They saw ghosts in the machine. Jackson saw a ticket out. He felt the sweat pooling at the base of his spine. This was it, the precipice. He could walk away, keep his paltry savings, and slowly starve to death on this rust bucket station. Or he could buy a ghost story. His hand moved before his brain could talk him out of it. He raised the paddle. The drone swiveled toward him. Bid acknowledged. 2,000 credits, looking for 2,500. Silence stretched. The Valkyrie broker looked at Jackson with something akin to pity in its multiple eyes. It was the look you gave a man stepping out of an airlock without a suit, going once. Jackson held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Don't bid against me. Please, just let me have this. Going twice. The drone paused, scanning the room one last time. Sold. To the human in row 3. Jackson let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He stood up, his legs feeling like jelly. He walked to the console to transfer the credits, his hands shaking just enough to be noticeable. He plugged in his chip. The balance zeroed out. He was destitute now, completely and utterly broke. But he owned a ship. The auctioneer drone dispensed a data chit, access codes and docking coordinates. Warning: Station authority accepts no liability for biological or psychological contamination incurred aboard Vin vessels. Have a pleasant day. Jackson took the chit. It felt heavy, warm to the touch. He turned and walked out, ignoring the stares of the aliens. They weren't looking at him like he was clutter anymore. They were looking at him like he was a dead man walking. The walk to docking clamp 7 felt like a funeral procession of one. The industrial sector of the station was quieter, the corridors wider and darker. He passed sealed bulkheads and abandoned storage bays. The air here was colder, recycled too many times, tasting of stale ozone and metallic decay. He reached the viewport overlooking the clamp, and there she was. The hologram hadn't done it justice. The void skipper was a shadow against the starfield, blacker than the space around it. It sat on the docking clamps like a predator waiting to pounce. It didn't look abandoned. It looked patient. Jackson keyed in the code. The airlock cycled with a heavy, pressurized hiss that sounded too much like a sigh. The interior lights flickered on as he stepped across the threshold, bathing the corridor in a soft, clinical white glow. He expected dust. He expected the smell of rot or old oil, but the air that hit his face was crisp, clean, smelling faintly of pine and static. It was disturbing. A ship abandoned for decades shouldn't smell this new. Jackson took a step, his boot magnetizing to the deck with a heavy clank that echoed down the spine of the vessel. He froze, waiting for the security grid to fry him or a drone to drop from the ceiling. Nothing happened. The void skipper just hummed, a low vibration that traveled up through the soles of his feet and settled in his molars. He moved deeper. The layout was wrong. Vin ships were usually circular, built for multi-limbed crews who didn't care about gravity orientation. This ship was linear. Floor, ceiling, walls. It felt distinctly, unnervingly designed for 2 legs. He passed the mess hall. A single cup sat on a table, secured by a stasis field. He leaned in. Coffee. Black. It was still steaming, trapped in a bubble of frozen time. Ghosts, he muttered, the sound of his own voice startling him. Just ghosts and bad wiring. But the wiring wasn't bad. It was perfect. As he reached the engineering deck, the diagnostic panels lit up in sequence, tracking his movement. They weren't Vin glyphs. The text scrolling across the screens was blocky, angular, It took his brain a full 10 seconds to recognize the alphabet. English. Archaic, sharp-edged English. His stomach did a slow roll. The Vin didn't use English. Nobody used English outside of the Terran slums. He pulled his datapad, jacking into the nearest terminal. The connection port was obsolete, a physical rectangular slot, but he had an adapter for legacy tech. He always did. Scrappers didn't throw things away. The screen flooded with data. Project Oubliette. Quarantine protocol active. Sector 9 sealed. Sector 9. The vault. He found the door at the keel of the ship. It was a slab of blast-proof alloy 3 meters high, devoid of handles or keypads. A red light pulsed above it, steady as a heartbeat. Jackson checked the locking mechanism. It was electronic, layered with a biometric seal that had been dead for centuries, but the physical bolts were seized tight. "Okay," he said, rolling his shoulders. "We do this the hard way." He went back to the engineering bay and found a maintenance lever, a meter-long bar of dense, heavy steel. He wedged the flattened end into the seam of the blast door. He wasn't strong enough to move a 2-ton door, not on his own. Physics didn't care about his desperation, but physics did respect leverage. He jammed a piece of scrap metal under the bar to create a fulcrum, moving the pivot point closer to the door. He leaned his entire weight onto the bar. The metal groaned. A high-pitched screech of friction filled the corridor. Jackson gritted his teeth, veins popping in his neck. "Give me an inch. Just give me 1 inch." The seal cracked. A hiss of escaping pressure hit him, smelling of ozone and something sharper, formaldehyde. The hydraulic assist systems detecting the breach whined to life and finished the job, sliding the heavy slab into the bulkhead with a shudder. Jackson dropped the bar, his hands trembling from the exertion. He pulled his rebreather up, covering his nose and mouth, and stepped into the cold. The vault was a tomb. It was vast, circular, and bathed in the harsh glare of ultraviolet sterilization strips. And it was full. Rows of vertical cylinders lined the walls, stretching up into the shadows. Hundreds of them. Mist curled around the base of the pods, heavy and clinging to the floor. Jackson walked to the nearest one, wiping the condensation from the glass with a gloved hand. The face inside was pale, the skin waxy and blue-tinged. A woman. She was suspended in a gel that refracted the light, making her look fractured. She wore a jumpsuit with a patch on the shoulder, a bird rising from flames. Legacy 1. Mission Specialist. Jackson stumbled back, his heel catching on a floor grate. He knew that name. Every human child knew that name. The Legacy 1 was the first colony ship, the hope of the species. It had vanished in the deep void 200 years ago. The history book said it was a navigational error, a tragic failure of primitive human engineering that proved mankind wasn't ready for the stars. "They didn't crash," Jackson whispered. He looked down the line of pods. They were taken. He moved to the console at the center of the room. The dust here was thick. He wiped it away, revealing a dashboard that looked like it belonged in a museum. He tapped the command key. Subject, status, cryo-suspension. Vitality, 48%. Revival recommended immediately. He didn't think. He didn't weigh the politics or the danger. He just saw a human being trapped in a jar. He initiated the sequence for the woman in the first pod. The machine groaned. Pumps cycled. The gel inside the pod began to drain, replaced by a flushing solution. The glass hissed and retracted. The woman fell forward. Jackson caught her. She was freezing, her body a dead weight against his chest. He lowered her to the metal grating, ripping off his jacket to cover her. Her skin was ice. He knew the danger of rapid rewarming thermal shock could stop a heart in seconds. He rubbed her arms vigorously, trying to generate friction heat, keeping her blood moving without shocking her system. "Come on," he urged. "Breathe. You have to breathe," she gasped. It was a terribly wet sound, like a drowning victim breaking the surface. Her eyes flew open, wide and blown with panic. She thrashed, her limbs flailing, striking Jackson in the jaw. "Easy!" Jackson grabbed her wrists, pinning them gently but firmly to her chest. He dropped his weight back, sitting on his heels, lowering his profile. He showed her his empty palms. "Look at me. Look at my hands. I'm not them. You're safe. The woman Dr. Aris, the readout had said, stared at him. Her chest heaved. The terror in her eyes was primal, the look of an animal cornered in a trap. She focused on his face, then on the room around them. The boarding party, she rasped, her voice like grinding glass. Where are the Vin? Jackson froze. The Vin are dead. Their empire collapsed 50 years ago. Aris blinked, the words not registering. She tried to sit up, coughing up pink fluid. 50 years? No, the attack was hours ago. Captain Vance, he tried to hold the airlock. Listen to me. Jackson leaned in, his voice hard but steady. You've been asleep a long time. It's 2412. The Legacy One has been missing for 2 centuries. She went still. The fight drained out of her, leaving only a hollow, horrific realization. She looked at her hands, then back at the rows of sleeping crewmates. Missing. She let out a laugh that sounded more like a sob. We didn't go missing. We were intercepted. She grabbed Jackson's collar, pulling him down, her grip shockingly strong for someone who had been dead 10 minutes ago. They didn't want to kill us, she hissed, her eyes burning with a feverish intensity. They wanted the drive, the legacy drive. It wasn't a combustion engine, you understand? It was a dimensional bore. We cracked the code. We solved the distance problem. Jackson shook his head. Humanity doesn't have dimensional tech. We buy warp cores from the Velkari. We're a tier 3 species. We're barely literate compared to them. Because they stole it, Aris screamed, the sound echoing off the cold metal walls. The Vin, the Throws, the Council, they didn't uplift you. They mugged us in the dark. They took the drive. They took the math, and they put us in these jars so they could dissect our brains to figure out how to use it. They didn't save humanity. They lobotomized it. Jackson sat back on his heels. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy with the weight of a 200-year-old crime. He looked at the ship around him, the Void Skipper. It wasn't a Vin courier. It was a stolen prototype. A human ship, painted over and repurposed by the very thieves who had enslaved his people. Then we take it back, Jackson said, the words tasting like iron. We wake them up, all of them. Speed was the only currency that mattered now, and they were bankrupt. The next hour wasn't heroic. It was a triage of fluids, shivering bodies, and the acrid stench of revival sickness. Jackson moved down the rows like a man possessed, keying in override codes while Aris dragged semi-conscious crew members to the floor, wrapping them in thermal blankets found in the emergency lockers. The vault echoed with the sounds of retching and the confused, guttural moans of 70 people waking up in hell. "Pod 12 is jamming!" Jackson shouted, his fingers slick with condensation. He slammed the manual release with the heel of his hand. The latch blew, spraying hydraulic fluid across his chest. The hatch hissed open. A hand shot out, grabbing the rim of the pod with a grip that dented the metal. Commander Vance didn't fall out. He pulled himself up. He was a mountain of a man, stripped to his undershirt, skin covered in the fading map of old scars. He looked at Jackson, then at Aris, then at the chaos of his crew. He didn't blink. He didn't ask what year it was. He looked at the weapon strapped to Jackson's hip, a rusty magnetic pistol, and nodded once. "Situation," Vance barked. His voice was gravel grinding on concrete. "Awakening," Aris said, her voice shaking as she checked a pulse on a young inside. "We've been under for 2 centuries, Commander. The mission failed. The Vin took us." Vance's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. That was the only sign that his world had just crumbled. "Hostiles? Everywhere," Jackson said. "We're on a station called 7 Alpha, and we just tripped every silent alarm in the sector." As if on cue, the ship lurched. It wasn't an engine vibration this time. It was an impact, a heavy, dull thud that rang through the hull, plating like a bell. "Proximity alert," the ship's AI droned, the voice now switching to a deeper, more urgent tone. "Multiple vessels detecting. Signatures match. Throws heavy cruisers. Velkari interceptors. You are being hailed." "Don't answer," Vance ordered. He stepped out of the pod, his bare feet slapping on the cold grating. "Get me to the bridge. Aris, get the engineers conscious. If they can't walk, drag them." The run to the bridge was a blur of steel corridors and flashing red emergency lights. Jackson took the pilot's seat, his hands flying over the console. He knew this board. He'd spent 5 years stripping consoles just like it, but he'd never seen one fully lit, alive with raw data. The viewport showed a nightmare. Space was crowded. Sixth-rows cruisers, shaped like hammerheads, formed a blockade around the docking spire. Smaller Valkyrie fighters swarmed like angry wasps, their weapon ports blowing with charging plasma. "They aren't hailing to talk," Jackson said, his throat dry. "They're charging main batteries. They're going to vaporize the evidence." Vance stood behind the captain's chair, leaning over the tactical display. "They can't fire yet. They're too close to the station. They need us to clear the dock so they don't blow up their own trade hub." "We can't fight that," Jackson said. "This is a courier ship. I have 2 kinetic cannons and a shield generator that's probably older than my grandfather." "We don't fight," a voice said from the doorway. The woman stumbled onto the bridge, supported by 2 other crewmen. She was pale, shaking, but her eyes were sharp. "Chief Engineer Jory." She looked at the engine readouts and let out a sharp, breathless laugh. "They never changed the manifold," she whispered. "The idiots. They stole the engine, but they didn't know how to tune the intake." "Can you give us speed?" Wentz asked. "I can give you something better," Jory said, limping to the engineering station. She shoved Jackson's datapad aside and dug her fingers into the holographic interface. "The legacy drive isn't just propulsion. It's a probability engine. It folds space based on quantum observation. But the VIN, they put safety locks on it. They tried to force it to behave like a linear drive." "Can you unlock it?" Jackson asked. "I can break it," Jory corrected. "I can redline the core. It will strip the safety protocols. The drive will try to exist in multiple coordinates simultaneously before it collapses into a single point." "A probability jump," Aris said, realizing the math. "We'd be untargetable." "For about 10 seconds, Jory said, "but we need to clear the station's gravity well first. If we jump this close to the dock, we'll take the station with us." "We have to undock," Jackson said, sweat stinging his eyes. "The second we disconnect, those cruisers will turn us into slag. I can't outrun a plasma torpedo in sublight." "You don't have to outrun them," Vance said. He pointed to the defensive subsystems menu. "You just have to make them blink." Jackson looked where the commander was pointing. "Holographic array. Status dormant. This ship was built for stealth," Vance said. "The VIN used it to spy, but the emitters are powerful. High-fidelity projection." Jackson's mind raced. He was a scrapper. He knew how sensors worked. He knew that throws targeting computers prioritized thermal signatures and visual confirmation. If he could overload their sensors— "Force multiplication," Jackson muttered. The plan formed in his head, desperate and stupid. "We don't hide, we flood the zone." "Do it," Vance said. Jackson punched the release on the docking clamps. The void skipper dropped free, drifting into the open void. Immediately, the comms board lit up with weapon locks. 12 distinct target tones screamed in the cockpit. "Shields up!" Jackson yelled. A lance of green energy slammed into the aft quarter. The ship shuddered violently, sparks showering from the ceiling. "Shields at 60%, Jory screamed from the engineering station. "Drive is spooling." "I need 30 seconds. You have 10. Jackson slammed the throttle forward, but instead of running away, he spun the ship on its axis, facing the fleet. He hammered the command for the holographic array. "Deployment. Maximum gain. Burn the emitters out if you have to." Space around them didn't just shimmer, it exploded with light. Dozens of ships flickered into existence. They weren't just images, they were full-spectrum sensor ghosts, pumping out heat and electronic noise. To the alien fleet, the single void skipper instantly became a squadron of 50 heavy attack vessels, all charging head-on. The Throw's cruisers hesitated. It was only for a second the OODA loop of the alien commanders stalling as they tried to process the sudden armada. Their targeting computers fractured, trying to lock onto 50 signals at once. "They're flinching," Vance roared. "Jory, now, Core is critical. Jory slammed her hand onto the activation panel. Hold on to something. The hum of the engine changed. It wasn't a mechanical sound anymore. It was the sound of reality tearing. The air on the bridge turned ozone sharp. Jackson looked at his hands and saw them flicker solid, then transparent, then solid again. The viewport distorted. The stars smeared into infinite lines of color. The alien fleet, the station, the darkness, it all bent inward, like oil swirling down a drain. Pain hit Jackson like a hammer, a headache that felt like his brain was being pulled in two different directions. He saw the station behind them, and simultaneously, he saw the red dust of Mars, the rings of Saturn, and the blue marble of Earth. He was everywhere at once. "Collapse the wave!" Vance shouted, his voice sounding like it was coming from underwater. Jory pulled the lever. The universe snapped. The snap wasn't a sound, it was a physical rejection, a violent expulsion from nowhere to somewhere. Jackson slammed forward into the console, his harness digging a trench into his collarbone. His stomach emptied itself instantly, a bitter heave of bile that splashed against the pristine VIN instrument panel. The air pressure dropped, popped his ears, and then equalized with a hiss that sounded like a snake in the cockpit. He gasped, sucking in air that felt too thick, too heavy. "Report." Vance's voice was a rasp behind him. The commander hadn't fallen. He was gripping the back of Jackson's chair, his knuckles white, blood trickling from his nose. Jackson wiped his mouth with the back of his glove and forced his eyes to focus on the viewport. The kaleidoscopic madness of the jump was gone. In its place was a stillness that terrified him more than the violence. A blue marble hung in the black, swirled with white clouds, brown continents, vast oceans. "Earth, we made it," Jory whispered over the comms, her voice thinned by exhaustion. "Sol system. High orbit." But it wasn't empty. The tactical display lit up like a Christmas tree. Red icons, hundreds of them, the Sol defense grid, orbital platforms, drone swarms, and heavy destroyers were already turning, their targeting scanners painting the void skipper with enough radiation to cook a steak. Unidentified vessel. A voice crackled over the open channel. It was bored, bureaucratic, and utterly lethal. "You have breached the Sol exclusion zone. Power down immediately, or be vaporized. You have 10 seconds. "They think we're an invasion," Jackson said, his hands hovering over the shield controls. "Shields are dead. One hit and we're dust." "Broadcast the package," Vance ordered. He didn't look at the targeting lasers. He looked at the planet. Every frequency. UHF, subspace, military encrypted. Open the throat. Aris was already moving, uploading the manifest, the stasis logs, the theft data, sending it now. Jackson watched the comms display. A massive packet of data, turd tides of 200-year-old crimes burst from their antenna. It hit the Earth network with the force of a physical blow. For 5 seconds, nothing happened. The targeting locks remained. The destroyers drifted closer, their railguns charging. Then the comms board went silent. The targeting lasers flickered and died. "Stand by," the voice from Earth returned. It wasn't bored anymore. It was trembling. "Stand by, unidentified vessel. Connecting you to high command." The main screen shimmered and resolved into a face. High Chancellor Holloway. Jackson recognized her from the news feeds, a woman of steel and policy, usually seen shaking hands with alien diplomats, smiling that subservient, junior species smile. She wasn't smiling now. She was sitting in a bunker, her face illuminated by the glow of a datapad. She looked pale, sick. "This data," Holloway said. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask who they were. She just held up the pad. The signatures matched the legacy mission. "But that's impossible." "It's not impossible," Vance said, stepping into the frame. "It's history, and you've been reading the wrong book." Holloway stared at Vance. She looked at the uniform, the scars, the eyes that had seen a century of ice. "Commander Vance, you're supposed to be a statue in the Geneva Memorial." "I'm not a statue," Vance growled. "I'm the evidence." "Chancellor!" A technician's voice screamed in the background of Holloway's feed. "Slipspace rupture detected. Sector 4. Massive signatures." Jackson looked at his own sensors. The blood drained from his face. Space behind them tore open. Not one ship, Not a patrol. A fleet. The throws had tracked the quantum wake. 3 heavy cruisers dropped out of warp, flanked by Velkari interceptors. They didn't hail. They didn't posture. They opened fire. Evasive, Vance roared. Jackson slammed the thrusters, but the engines were dead. The Void Skipper drifted sluggishly. A plasma bolt clipped their starboard wing, sending a shudder through the frame that knocked Aris to the deck. "Sol Command!" Halloween's voice was shouting now. "Defend that ship." "They can't," Vance said, calm amidst the chaos. "Your ships are Tier 3. Those cruisers will peel your destroyers like fruit." "Then what do we do?" Halloway screamed. The veneer of the politician cracked, revealing the terrified human underneath. "You stop being polite," Vance said. "Aris, the degradation protocols. Activate the back door." Aris crawled to the engineering console, linking to the throws network, uploading the cascade failure signal. "What are you doing?" Halloway demanded. "We built that tech," Vance said, his eyes fixed on the approaching cruisers. "We built it to fail." Aris hit the key. On the viewport, the lead throws cruiser fired its main cannon. The beam formed, bright as a sun, and then fractured. The cruiser's engines flared violet, pulsing wildly. The ship listed, its lights flickering out. Then the second ship. Then the third. The mighty alien fleet, the hammers of the galaxy, simply died. They drifted, powerless, their systems eating themselves from the inside out. Silence fell over the bridge. Absolute, heavy silence. "You turned them off," Halloway whispered. The realization hit her, visible in the widening of her eyes. "All of it. The medical scanners, the warp gates, the trade routes. It's all based on your designs." "We own the patent," Vance said, "and we just revoked the license." Halloway looked down at her hands. For 40 years, she had led a government that bowed and scraped, grateful for scraps from the alien table. She had policed her own people to keep the peace. Now she realized the table had been built on human bones. Her expression hardened. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating anger. She looked up. "Commander, bring your ship in. We have a lot to discuss." "We're not landing," Vance said. "We're staying in orbit. We'll send you the rest of the codes, but the ship stays with us." "Understood," Halloway said. She cut the feed. The bridge crew let out a collective breath. Jory slumped over the engineering console, weeping silently. Aris was checking the vitals of the sleepers still in the vault. Jackson sat in the pilot's chair. His hands were still gripping the yoke, his knuckles locked. He tried to let go, but his fingers wouldn't obey. He looked out at the drifting hulks of the alien warships, then down at the blue curve of Earth. He should be happy. They had won. They were home. He was a hero. But he didn't feel like a hero. He felt the cold metal of the armrest. He smelled the recycled air of the vault. He remembered the look in the Velkari broker's eyes. Not respect, but fear. He realized then that he could never go down there. He couldn't walk on the dirt, breathe the open air, or pay for a meal with credits he hadn't bled for. That world down there, the politicians, the museums, the parades, it was soft. It was asleep. He looked at Vance, who was staring into the black, already planning the next battle. He looked at Aris, whose eyes held the trauma of 2 centuries. Jackson wasn't a salvage dealer anymore. He wasn't a scrapper. He had seen the machinery behind the curtain, the gears of the galaxy grinding meat into money. "You don't come back from that. You don't go home, Commander," Jackson said, his voice quiet, steady. Vance turned. "Status, pilot?" Jackson finally pried his hands off the controls. They were shaking, a fine, rhythmic tremor that he knew would never fully stop. "Engines are cooling," Jackson said. "Give me an hour. I can get us moving again." "Moving where?" Aris asked, looking up. "We're home." Jackson looked at the dead fleet, then at the infinite hostile dark beyond it. "No," Jackson said. "We're just getting started." He keyed the diagnostic cycle. The Void Skipper hummed a deep, hungry sound. It wasn't a rescue ship. It was a weapon. And for the first time in his life, Jackson knew exactly which end of the gun he was holding. The story might be over, but the survival mechanics are real. Let's break down the 3 tactical concepts that kept Jackson and the crew alive, so you can understand the science behind the fiction. The physics of torque. When Jackson opened that sealed vault, he didn't use brute strength. He couldn't. That door weighed 2 tons, and the mechanism was rusted shut. He used a cheater bar. This is pure physics. Torque equals force times distance. By jamming a long steel bar into the mechanism and placing a fulcrum close to the door, Jackson multiplied his output force. A human pushing with 50 kilograms of force on a 2-meter bar can generate enough torque to snap industrial bolts. In survival, if you can't be strong, be long. Use leverage. The psychology of normalcy bias. Why was the auction empty? Why did hundreds of experienced alien traders ignore a pristine warship? It's called normalcy bias. When the brain faces something it doesn't understand, like a ship that keeps coming back empty, it defaults to the safest, most common explanation to avoid panic. In this case, it's cursed. It's a mental blind spot. The aliens chose a comfortable superstition over the uncomfortable reality of investigating a conspiracy. They ignored the anomaly because it didn't fit their pattern of normal life. Jackson won because he looked at the data, not the ghost story. The execution of electronic warfare. That final escape wasn't magic, it was sensor spoofing. In modern naval and aero combat, missiles and targeting computers don't see with eyes, they see with radar and heat signatures. They lock onto the strongest signal. By using the holographic emitters to create loud, false targets, high-energy ghosts, Jackson flooded the enemy sensors with noise. It's called distraction jamming. A guided missile is like a moth. It flies toward the brightest light. Jackson just lit 50 other candles so the real ship could slip away in the dark. Study the tactics, ignore the superstition, and keep your eyes open.